Hey, what's up, everybody? This is the Guilty as Charged podcast. My name is Stephen Hagland. I am your host. Joining me today for our Broncos preview, Broncos Intel, whatever you want to call it, is Mr. Zac Stevens, Broncos beat reporter for DNVR and podcast host. Zac, we chatted before this season. Happy to have you on today. And how are you doing, man?
Oh, I'm doing great. You know what? I'm doing better than the Broncos. Up until this past week, the Broncos were doing pretty good, especially for their standards the past couple of years. But that loss to the Raiders kind of took any hope for the season away from them.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear last week when Justin Simmons had said after the Bengals loss that that game was essentially do or die when they were technically still in it had they been able to beat the Raiders. But I feel like you have been pretty positive throughout the season, heading into the Kansas City Chiefs game. It was the battle for first place, and the playoff hopes have been alive throughout the late stretches of November and early December. So where are you at right now with kind of the state of the Broncos and their future, and Vic Fangio as a head coach in particular?
Yeah, I mean, everything with the Broncos is up in the air. And when I say everything, I mean even the ownership. So the state of the Broncos is in as flux as any organization in sports really can be, because you have the ownership situation, which will be taken care of after this season. But of course, that's been in flux almost a decade. Now you have ownership that's going to be changed. You also have a general manager. He's probably the guy with the safest job in Denver right now,
Right.
George Paton. He's done a really good job this season outside of the quarterback position. He seems to be a guy that will keep his job after the new owner is here. Then your head coach is up in the air. All of your offensive staff and defensive staff is up in the air, and your quarterback is up in the air. So, I mean, the state of the Broncos is, if you don't think those things are going to get resolved in a positive fashion, then the state of the Broncos is terrible. If you think that Peyton Manning's going to come in and be part of an ownership group for the Broncos and get the right quarterback for the future, okay, then the Broncos, they have some good pieces on their team right now. But
Right.
the Broncos this season, it's pretty much status quo as it's been the last 5 years, except the Broncos are a little better this year. 7 wins marks the most wins they've had since 2016, and they still have 2 more games, one against the Chargers, to potentially make that the most wins they've had since 2016. But if you just miss the playoffs, that's about the worst position a team can be in,
Yeah.
especially one that needs a quarterback like the Broncos.
Yeah, and it really just puts them in a excuse me, in a tough situation, because I feel like Vic is a solid head coach. At least defensively. I've always been a little jealous of how you guys don't have any linebackers, and then you trade for some linebackers, and the defense is still a top unit. I was hoping Brandon Staley would kind of bring that same kind of results to the Chargers. Hasn't happened yet. But for whatever reason, the offense just has not really shown any growth under Vic Fangio. So I guess my next question here is, do you move on from Vic Fangio like verbatim, or is it you hire a different offensive coordinator and then you kind of see what you have in Vic Fangio with the new offensive coordinator and potentially a new quarterback next year?
That's the question right now. That's a question everyone wants to know. But one thing that is certain is there will be a new offensive staff, at least a new offensive coordinator next year, because what the Broncos have done under Pat Shurmur has been terrible, Steven. And so the Broncos have to change that. And that's kind of, these next 2 weeks are huge for Vic, because of course in the NFL now, the Broncos could have moved on from Vic Fangio yesterday and started their search for a new head coach. The fact that they didn't at least is a step that George Paton is considering keeping Vic Fangio around. And look, George Paton really likes Vic Fangio, the person Vic Fangio, the football mind. He has to decide if that football mind is worth it to keep around as a head coach, because of course Vic Fangio struggled. It reminds me a lot of Anthony Lynn last year in game situations, game management, stuff that's not necessarily the X's and O's. He's really struggled, and that has drove Broncos fans absolutely crazy this year. But his defense, it's the best in the league right now in terms of points per game, elite. And so George has to decide, does he want to have his footprint on bringing in the next head coach, or is he just okay with having his footprint on the next offensive coordinator? And right now, it does seem like they're leaning on moving on from Vic, but I would not be surprised if they keep Vic for a fourth season, because another reason why they may do that is with this new ownership that's going to come in, they may not want to strap a new owner who has no say on this head coach with a 5-year contract for this new head coach. They may say, let's keep it status quo for one more year, and then we'll let this next owner do his thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously a lot up in the air for the Broncos, and I appreciate your thoughts there. I want to dive into this game. Obviously, the quarterback situation, we talked about it before the season started. There was the quarterback competition, and then of course they chose Teddy. Now it's Drew Lock because Teddy Bridgewater is hurt. First of all, can you update our listeners on Teddy's health status and kind of what you kind of hinted at it, but what the offense has been like with Drew Lock in place of Teddy Bridgewater the last few weeks?
Yeah, Teddy is still in the concussion protocol, and for a second straight week, that is not a good sign. And this is Teddy's second concussion of the season. With the Broncos, having a playoff chances of 0.1%, it's not worth rushing Teddy Bridgewater back right now. And Vic Fangio has said time and time again over these past 10 days that they're going to do right by Teddy Bridgewater's health and not rush him back. So I imagine it's going to be Drew Lock, not just this week, but also in week 18 when the Broncos play the Chiefs. And Drew Lock, he has been kind of what you expect. There have been some good throws that he's had. And this past week, when he got his first full start this year, it's actually the best he's played this entire season. He didn't have any touchdowns. He didn't have any interceptions, which is key. He did not turn the ball over, and he managed the game. And that's something that Drew Lock has not been able to do. He either is, throwing dimes and making fourth quarter comebacks against teams like the Chargers, as the Chargers know last year, or he's throwing interceptions, having strip sacks, throwing it into a sea of defenders, and that has been more of Drew Lock than the fourth quarter comebacks. But this week, he was a game manager, and that was something that the Broncos need for the most part, but he wasn't able to take the game over. And the Broncos rushing attack was so bad against the Raiders that it just amounted to an abysmal offensive performance. The Broncos had 158 total offensive yards. They had 8 first downs, which is the fewest they've had when they've had a quarterback starting at that position since 1992. They were 1 of 10 on third downs. It was just absolutely brutal. And so Drew Lock was the center of that. So that game was the best that he's done, but it's not like it was record breaking or an incredible performance by him. The other 3 times that he's been on the field this year in a relief performance when Teddy's got hurt mid game, Drew has been that Drew Lock of turning the ball over, making terrible decisions, and that is why I'm not ready to say Drew has turned a corner and the Chargers are going to see a great Drew Lock this week.
Well, it's tough to say he's turned a corner after, seeing an offense put up 158 yards in an NFL game. So, I mean, great that he didn't turn the ball over, but, there's got to be, like we said before the season, there's got to be some balance between gunslinger Drew Lock and game manager Teddy Bridgewater in this case, leading up to this game.
Yeah, exactly. And with Drew Lock not having any turnovers this past week, it points the fact that he's probably going to have 1 or 2 this week. And now, of course, Drew Lock also last year not only led that fourth quarter comeback, but then probably played well enough to beat the Chargers in LA at the end of the season last year. Of course, that was Jerry Jeudy's 5-drop performance, just a historically bad performance. Good news is Jerry Jeudy only has 1 drop on the season so far. Bad news is it happened when Drew Lock threw him the ball this past week. So we'll see if those two can get on a better page. But I mean, Steven, the Broncos defense has been stepping up for the most part this season. The Broncos offense has really, really been fluttering, and it's been the quarterback, it's been the receivers, and really the person getting all the blame is Pat Shurmur.
Yeah, I mean, rightfully so. We'll see what happens this week. The Chargers, frankly, could be trotting out the cast of the replacements in the secondary this week with all the COVID issues and things like that. Derwin's been hurt, and obviously Derwin James had that interception on Drew Lock earlier in the first game. So we'll have to see kind of how that one plays out. But I want to talk about this defense because, man, it is a ferocious, front seven. Even after, trading Von Miller and after all these linebackers, Josie Jewell gets hurt. So is it as simple as guys stepping up, or what's kind of been, the driving force behind the success of the Broncos front seven, over the last 6-8 weeks or so?
Yeah, it's really it's two things in my mind. The first is Vic Fangio and what he's been able to do with that linebacking core. You said it. The Broncos have lost their starting inside linebackers, Alexander Johnson and Josie Jewell, early in the season. Both of those
Mhm.
guys went down, so they had to turn to their backups. Well, then those guys went down. Then they had to turn to their third string guys. Those guys went down. They're on their eighth inside
It's
linebacker
crazy.
right now. Literally fourth string guys that didn't even start the season on the Broncos practice squad. That's who they're working with. And a guy named Jonas Griffith has come in the past couple games and has absolutely balled. I mean, he's been really,
Yeah.
really good. And so it's a little bit credit to George Paton, the Broncos general manager, for identifying this talent. But then you have to give credit to Vic Fangio. And Vic Fangio, one of the best inside linebacker coaches of all time. And apparently he's really good because it's been working for the Broncos. Whoever they've had at inside linebacker has played pretty darn well this season, including a guy named Jonas Griffith right now. So I start with giving a ton of credit to Vic Fangio for not only helping the inside linebackers, but really when the Broncos have had holes, he's been able to plug it with not household name guys even in Denver. And then the
Yeah.
second reason the front seven has been able to play so well is this secondary. This secondary got torched the first 5 weeks of the season. Since they have really stepped up, and it's been led by Patrick Surtain. The rookie has
Mhm.
been the dominant shutdown corner that the Broncos hoped he would be when they picked him above Justin Fields, above Mac Jones. And then you also have Justin Simmons, who probably should have been a Pro Bowler this year. I do
Yeah.
believe he and Patrick Surtain, probably the only Pro Bowl true snubs on the Broncos this year. Kareem Jackson's also really good. And then guys that were getting burned earlier in the season, Ronald Darby's, Kyle Fuller's, those guys have looked really good as well. So the Broncos secondary has really come together. And we saw it this past week. Derek Carr, he's like to take shots. He's put up many 400-yard games this season. He was throwing it behind the line of scrimmage, seemingly more than past the line of scrimmage this week, because he would look after taking the snap. Everything was covered. He'd dump it off to a running back. They'd pick up 4 yards. And that game was just death by paper cut. But also, the Raiders didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to force the ball because they knew the Broncos offense wasn't going to do anything.
Right.
And so that's something that Justin Herbert, I know he's a gunslinger and wants to toss the ball, but the Chargers, like they have for some of this season, may just hold him back and say, look, we're going to win this game 20-13, and it's not going to look good for the numbers, but we're going to be able to get the job done that way. And we're not going to have to risk it by throwing it to Patrick Surtain, because the last time Justin Herbert tried to do that, obviously turned into 2 interceptions.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one to keep an eye on, because the Chargers have recently found success with their running game, even without Austin Eckler, who should be back in this matchup. So that is going to be, Matt Filer didn't play in the first game. Justin Jackson wasn't healthy in the first game. So it's going to be interesting to see the adjustments that Joe Lombardi and the offense make. And for the record, I do agree that Justin Simmons was snubbed. He, I think, is one of the best safeties in the league. I think he's underrated. Unfortunately, one of my favorite non-Chargers to watch. Just love the way that he attacks things, and he's been a fantastic player for the last few years there in Denver. So I do agree there for sure.
Yeah, and the Broncos, for the first time since 1980, didn't have a single Pro
Wow.
Bowler, and they were the only team, or they were one of 6 teams that did not have a Pro Bowler this year. All the teams had 4 fewer losses. So Broncos, and I don't mean to be a homer here, but the Broncos shouldn't have had 5 Pro Bowlers. They probably should have had just 1 or 2, with those guys in the secondary leading the way.
Yeah, no, I'm on the same page there. And, you mentioned Patrick Surtain, obviously of Baron Browning making a strong impact. I thought he was incredible in the first matchup, and really kind of speaks to this rookie class that, George Paton had in his first, year as Broncos general manager. Outside of Browning and Surtain, I guess Javonte Williams too, kind of adds to that, of course. But update us on some of the younger players that are getting time for the Broncos outside of kind of those big 3 right there.
Yeah, and those were the Broncos' first 3 picks, so you expect a lot out of them. But then the Broncos' final pick in the draft, a 7th rounder named Jonathan Cooper, a rookie this year from Ohio State. He's been an absolute baller. The Broncos have had to turn to him after trading Von Miller, after Bradley Chubb got injured, after their backup outside linebacker, who's now a starter, Malik Reed, got injured. They've had to turn to Jonathan Cooper, and he at times has been their best pass rusher. He is just a beast. He can probably start on many teams in the NFL already as a rookie, so the Broncos absolutely nailed it with him. Broncos have a safety. Now, he's a backup safety because they have Kareem Jackson and Justin Simmons playing ahead of him, but a guy named Caden Stearns who's playing really, really well, and he projects to take over as a starter next year. It's expected that the Broncos won't re-sign Kareem Jackson because of how good Caden Stearns is playing. And then there's one other guy you may know from the draft process. His name is Quinn Meinertz, and he's a guard for the Broncos. Just took over a couple of weeks ago as the full-time starter, and this guy came from Division III Wisconsin Whitewater. They didn't play football last year, so in order for him to show the NFL what he can do, he started making his own tapes of him like plowing over dead trees up there and at his family's farm in Canada, and snapping balls to trash cans to show his accuracy snapping the ball. And it was all kind of goofy. He's a guy that lets his belly hang out, and so he's kind of known for his belly, but he's actually playing really good football. And you know what? Outside of this Raiders game, the Broncos have been running the ball exceptionally well since the bye week and since the Broncos' first matchup against the Chargers when they ran the ball well. Before last week, they're rushing for over 160 yards per game since the bye. And then last week, it all exploded. I mean, Melvin Gordon, 7 carries for -4 yards against the Raiders. Javonte Williams and Melvin, I believe, combined 14 carries for 8 yards. Drew Lock had 2 long runs for the Broncos on the day, which I believe was 5 and 6 yards. I would fully expect the Chargers to just take the exact same game plan that the Raiders did and say, we are going to do everything to shut down your run game. And if Drew Lock's, congratulations to Drew, he beat us. But as the Raiders found out last week, Drew Lock didn't beat them. I mean, even though he threw 15 of 22, didn't have an abysmal passer rating, didn't have any turnovers, he was nowhere close to beating them. The Chargers should absolutely take that approach because the Raiders defense is not good, and they were still able to completely shut down the Broncos rushing attack.
Well, I am definitely not expecting, combined 8 yards this week from Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon. The Chargers should get some reinforcements from the COVID list. But, Brandon Staley said after that game, we did a lot of 8-man fronts. We just didn't have the energy. We didn't have the, aggression and attitude that you need. And it's like, well, that was against Rex Burkhead and an awful Texans team. Now you're facing the Broncos offensive line, which is really good, I think, and 2 really, really good running backs. So I'm definitely expecting the Broncos rushing attack at least to get back on track this week.
Yeah, and it's going to have to, regardless of who the quarterback is, but especially because it's Drew. And how I transitioned to that in the last question, I forgot to tie it all together, was this Broncos offensive line has been okay this season. I mean, really hit or miss, but against the pass and pass protection, they've struggled, specifically the interior of the offensive line with a lot of rotation they've had, a lot of young guys coming in, Quinn Meinertz being one of them. But in terms of a run offensive line, again, besides this past week against the Raiders, they have been dominant. And Quinn Meinertz is a guy who is already an above average run blocker in the NFL. Pass blocking still can use some work. The Broncos were without their starting center this past week due to COVID. With the new COVID protocols, seemingly like the NFL is going to change in the middle of this week, it seems like they could probably have him back, which would be huge. But the Broncos, without a doubt, are going to have to run the ball and have to run it a ton to have any success, regardless of who the quarterback is, but especially if it's Drew.
No, yeah, I'm absolutely on the same page there. So, we'll get you out of here on this and just kind of your general. Of course, it's tough to, project what's going to happen in these situations, right? The team doesn't have a ton to play for. Just kind of your general thoughts of what you expect in terms of, will they show up? Will they be competitive? What are you expecting from the Broncos over these last 2 weeks?
Yeah, I expect the defense to show up and be very competitive. I would be naive to say that the offense is going to show up because it hasn't shown up the past few weeks when the Broncos have desperately needed it. But I expect this defense. Vic Fangio always has these guys ready to go. And this defense wants to finish the season as the best defense in the NFL. Right now, they're tied with the Patriots for allowing only 17 points per game, which is the best in the NFL. They're going to want to put their stamp on that. And the way Vic Fangio proves to George Paton that he needs to be back next year is by shutting down Justin Herbert and Patrick Mahomes, because he needs to show George Paton, look, I've given the offense to Pat Shurmur, and Pat Shurmur has failed us. Keep me as the defensive guy. You're going to have to keep me as a head coach too. And I'm going to make this defense dominant in the AFC West, be able to contain Derek Carr, Justin Herbert, and Patrick Mahomes. And then we'll upgrade our offense, and then we'll truly be able to compete in this division. If the Broncos come out and Justin Herbert and Patrick Mahomes just have their way with this defense, it's going to be really hard to go out. The Broncos, I think, then would finish the season 4-10 after starting 3-0. If they lose these next two games, if they get torched, Vic's not going to have the defense to really hang his hat on. And it's also going to show that the players weren't really playing for Vic. So these final two games are huge for Vic Fangio. No one bigger than these final two games for Vic Fangio. And that's going to go a very long way in what this team looks like a year from now.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been great stuff from, again, Zac Stevens from DNVR. What do you guys have going this week, and where can our listeners find you guys if they want some good Broncos intel ahead of this matchup?
Unfortunately, if we're starting to look at the draft, see who's in play for the Broncos, actually
Okay.
looking at head coaching candidates, and also how the Broncos land one of these top quarterbacks, because despite what the Broncos have tried to do these past 5 years, I don't think defense is what wins in the NFL anymore. Maybe it can win you a couple of games, but you need the quarterback. And there's going to be a few big names out there. How can the Broncos land Russell Wilson? How can the Broncos land Aaron Rodgers? Are those possibilities? Because, man, what a division it would be if it's Justin
Right.
Herbert, Patrick
Absolutely.
Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, or Russell Wilson along with Derek Carr. Man, that would be something.
It really would be something, and the wild west would continue to be wild for sure. Zac Stevens, this has been great, man. Really appreciate your time. Chargers fans, be sure to check him out. Of course, you want to hear about how the Broncos could potentially get Aaron Rodgers. That would obviously be a huge storyline of the offseason. So, Zac, thanks again for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it.
Right on. Thanks for having me on.